White House records reveal something strange. After receiving a letter from the front, Lincoln cancels a prepared order at night, changing the fate of an entire army and his own. Abraham Lincoln became president after he simply sat down and wrote a letter. It sounds too simple, almost cliché, but behind this phrase lies a real story. No drama, no myths. Just one person, one piece of paper, and a moment when life takes a sudden turn. We often think that fate is shaped by major events, wars, elections, conspiracies. Sometimes it all starts with someone sitting down at a table at night, shutting out the noise around them and writing a few honest lines. And those lines hit much harder than bullets. Lincoln didn't come from a glamorous background. He didn't have an army of advisors or a bag full of money. He was that guy at the bottom, the one history usually overlooks. But at some point, he picks up a pen and writes a letter that becomes his ticket into the world of politics. It wasn't a love letter, a shout into the void, or a beautiful manifesto just for the sake of quotes. It was a letter where he took the chance to show his true self, his thoughts, his fears, his vision for the country. He had no idea that his words would reach people who could change his life. He just wrote what he genuinely felt. And that's where the real story begins. How does an ordinary letter turn into a turning point in history? What was it about those specific phrases that resonated with the recipient? And how did a little-known lawyer from Illinois become a national figure? There's no magic in this story, just a series of very human choices. Someone decided to write. Someone decided to read it all the way through. Someone decided to respond. And the world changed after that. We'll look into who Lincoln was writing to, what he said, and why that letter had such an impact at that moment. Let's view Lincoln not as a textbook monument, but as a person who doubted, got angry, and was afraid of looking foolish, yet still sat down and wrote. It's important to understand one thing. This isn't a story about luck. This is a story about how words, spoken at the right time and with honesty, can open a door that once seemed completely shut. We'll take it step by step to recreate that moment. The surroundings, Lincoln's situation, the context of the country, and the letter itself. What was in it that made it a turning point? And let's also tackle a simple yet uncomfortable question. How many chances have we missed, simply because we didn't have the courage to sit down and write our letter? That day, Lincoln took the envelope like it was a sentence, and he decided that the sentence would be rewritten. He sat in the White House, which felt more like a besieged fortress. Outside its walls, there was war. The maps in his office showed nothing but failures. The North was losing people, cities, and time. The newspapers screamed that the president was weak, that he couldn't pick the right generals, that he was dragging the country down. Lincoln had a list on paper of those who were meant to save the country. Generals, stars, epaulets, big names, those entrusted with armies, hopes, and the last reserves of strength. And almost every one of them had already let him down. One was too afraid to advance and spent weeks gathering troops while the enemy quietly slipped away. One lost the battle so badly that even his allies were left shaking their heads. The third was caught up not in war, but in politics and intrigue. Each of them once seemed like the best choice, on paper, in reports, in conversations, but not on the battlefield. And now Lincoln is opening an envelope with yet another report. Dry phrases, but behind them lies blood and chaos. Another missed opportunity. Another, we retreated, but saved the army. He knows this tone by heart, cautious, defensive. The tone of someone who fears making a mistake more than losing the war. Before him lies a list of commanders, names he once endorsed, names he defended before Congress, names he believed in. And now he picks up a pen and does what he's avoided for so long. He starts crossing them out. One stroke, another. A thick black line over the name that just yesterday was seen as the only hope. Lincoln doesn't rush. He takes his time looking at each name. He remembers the letters from the front lines. He thinks of the mothers who wrote back to him. He recalls how he defended these people to the nation. And he realizes that if he stays silent again now, it won't just be the general who's to blame. It will be him. He crosses off those who are used to fighting on paper, those who care more about their careers than about winning, those who always find a reason not to move forward. And nearby, in the fields, he adds new names, less known, less glamorous, but alive. Often, these are people he has only heard about in passing. An officer who didn't back down when others retreated. A commander who didn't abandon the wounded. A person who doesn't write long excuses, but simply gets the job done. Lincoln writes their names as if giving them a chance, while also issuing a challenge. He realizes that these edits could be his downfall. Every crossed-out name represents an enemy. Powerful, connected, loud. These people won't forgive. They'll go to the press, to Congress, to his opponents. They'll start whispering that the president has lost his mind and is changing leadership in the middle of a war. But he no longer has the luxury of fearing. Up until this day, he put up with their mistakes because he believed that the system would sort itself out. That seasoned military leaders know better how to conduct a war. That a civilian president shouldn't meddle too deeply in military matters. Now he sees that if he doesn't step in, the war will just consume the country. He looks at those crossed-out names and remembers his old letter, the one that started his journey into big politics. Back then, he took a risk too. He wrote honestly, without any embellishments. And this letter brought him from the provinces to the national stage. Now he's doing the same thing, but instead of words, it's lines of ink over other people's names. It's the same gesture, the same inner choice, not to hide behind someone else's authority. He accepts that he will be responsible for each of those signatures. What if the new people fail? There will be no one left to blame, no party, no generals, no fate, just his own hand gliding over the paper. But that's where his strength lies. He doesn't hide. He doesn't shift the responsibility. He's the same guy from the bottom who used to write honest letters, and now he's honestly rewriting the roster of the Army's top brass. At this moment, the war stops being an abstract map with flags for him. It becomes a personal stake, not just North versus South, but he's battling his own indecision against the habit of procrastinating until the last minute. When he puts down his pen, the list has already changed. The country doesn't know about it yet. The newspapers haven't reported it yet. The generals still haven't realized that their time is up. But the point of no return has been crossed. From this day on, every victory or defeat will count not just for the army, but also for the person who one night opened the envelope, looked at the old names, and decided to cross them out. Years later, one document will connect those choices to a childhood letter. Sometimes, it's not a general or a president who shapes a country's fate, but the uneven lines of a child's handwriting. A historian sits in a reading room that always has a hint of dust and old paper. In front of him is a box, just an ordinary cardboard box. Inside are letters, telegrams, and notes, strange voices trapped in envelopes for a century and a half. He sorts through them almost automatically. Signatures, dates, stamps, just the usual paper shuffle. And then he finds a tiny envelope, way too small for any serious government correspondence. It's scribbled on with the words, "To President Abraham Lincoln." No titles, no formalities. The handwriting is childlike. The letters dance as if written on a lap. The historian freezes. He knows what this could be. He has been on a long journey to this very letter. Carefully, he lifts the edge and unfolds it. The paper is fragile, almost transparent, with a yellowish tint. These sheets break with careless handling. But this one has survived war, moves, and rearrangements in the archive. Inside are a few short lines. It's written by a girl, 11 years old. Her name is Grace Bedell. She lives in a small town in New York State. She's not a politician, not the daughter of a senator, not the heir of some magnate. Just an ordinary kid from the mid-19th century. And she decides to give some advice to the presidential candidate about his appearance. She tells Lincoln straight up that he's too skinny and doesn't look very impressive. People need something to catch their eye. And she suggests a simple solution. He should grow a beard. She assures him that women will persuade their husbands to vote for such a respectable guy. She writes this without any embarrassment, honestly, and with a childlike sincerity. A historian reads these lines and realizes how incredibly simple it all sounds. The country is on the brink of division, with bloodshed, war, and the fates of millions ahead. And here's a little girl advising the future president to change his image. She does it as if she's writing to a neighbor. Lincoln received this letter. It hasn't been lost. It hasn't gone to the trash. It hasn't faded away in the sea of correspondence. He reads it at a time when the battle for the position is still underway. He's not yet that bronze statue, not a hero from textbooks. He's vulnerable. Few people know him. His appearance is already being talked about in the newspapers, often with mockery. He replies to the girl, saying that many people think his face isn't very attractive. He doesn't take offense or get angry. He's calm about it. He admits that he never really thought about his beard before. He's cautious and unsure about how she'll take it. But the very fact that he responds says a lot. He didn't have to write to her at all. But he does it. And then he clicks something. After just a little while, a new Lincoln appears in the photos. The one we're used to seeing, tall, in a black suit, with deep-set eyes and a thick beard. His face elongates, becoming more serious and composed. Clumsiness fades away, and a recognizable image emerges. The historian slowly scans the lines of the letter and the old photographs. Before and after. With a beard and without. This isn't just a trend. It's the transformation of a provincial lawyer into a figure of national significance. The face that will be printed on posters, engravings, and banknotes. The face that will become a symbol of war and liberation. The beard makes Lincoln look older, more serious, almost biblical. In a world without television and the internet, how someone looks in an engraving is everything. People in the villages will see not a living person, but their image. And this image needs to inspire trust, strength, wisdom, confidence that this person can weather the storm. At the heart of this image is a letter from an 11-year-old girl from a small town. For a historian, this isn't just a touching detail or a funny episode. It's the moment when an individual's personal story intersects with the larger political landscape. The usual suggestion of, "Maybe you should grow a beard," suddenly becomes part of a series of decisions that will take Lincoln to the heights of power, leading him to those very nights when he sits over lists of generals, crossing out old names. He carefully folds the letter back up. He stares at the envelope a bit longer than necessary, because he realizes that without this thin piece of paper, there might not be the Lincoln that the whole world knows. And somewhere between those uneven lines written by a child and the firm hand crossing out the names of generals, there lies the same line. The line of a person who once listened to a simple letter and could no longer live on autopilot. Now, another expert, pulls out an unfinished draft of a speech from a folder. The official story doesn't lie in the details, but in the most important part. It makes Lincoln seem smooth and straightforward, but he wasn't like that at all. An archive, a quiet room, a long table, gray light. A researcher sits over a folder that looks just like hundreds of others. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded. It feels like an ordinary rough draft at first. He reads it aloud in a whisper. The words are familiar from textbooks. Greatness, unity, nation, sacrifice. Everything sounds right. Everything feels solemn. The handwriting is shaky and stretched out. And then, suddenly, his gaze catches something. Between the line and the margin, there's a bold, dark spot. A word crossed out, as if Lincoln was angry with himself. The researcher holds the page up to the light. You can make out the letters beneath the strike-through. A word that has vanished completely from official publications. No gentle phrasing, no polished rhetoric. There's pain there. There's anger. There's a straightforward, almost blunt phrase that Lincoln tossed in at the last minute. And this is where the school image falls apart. We were taught about the wise, calm president who always knows the right thing to do. But on paper, it tells a different story. You can see a person who's unsure, struggling, arguing with themselves in every line. They slowly move through the text. On the left, there's the official story, and on the right, fields filled with corrections. At one point, Lincoln first writes, "I must," then crosses it out and writes, "We must." The personal turns into the collective. Responsibility hides behind the collective we. Elsewhere, he starts with punishment, then switches to trial. Too harsh, too honest, too exposed. The official version of the speech is polished to perfection. It's all nice and neat. There's no room for raw nerves. But in the draft, those nerves stick out from every line. Between the rhythmic phrases that will later make history, there are cut pieces that break the story. The researcher navigates these cuts like clues at a crime scene. The notes in the margins are brief, almost sharp. No, dangerous, too much, remove. Lincoln is his own editor and his own censor. He's not just protecting his reputation. He's safeguarding the country from his own words that could tear it apart even more. And this is where it becomes clear. The Lincoln we know from quotes and monuments is partly made of silence, of the things he didn't say, from what has been erased with a pen and can never return. But there's one detail that sends a chill down my spine. At the top of the page, above the first line, there's a small, almost illegible note. A word written in a hurry, like a personal reminder to myself. The researcher slowly pieces together the letters in his mind and realizes, this isn't a date. It's not a technical note. It's a name. A woman's name. The very one from that childhood letter he was never supposed to open. A little girl who suggested he grow a beard somehow appears above a draft of a speech written by a completely different Lincoln. The president. The commander-in-chief. The man of war. This isn't romantic sentimentality. It's the point where two lines come together as one. A personal story and a government decision. A child's voice and a voice from the stage, speaking to the nation. In official biographies, there's a wall between them, but in the draft of that wall, there's none. The researcher leans back in the chair and takes another look at the crossed-out phrases. Lincoln wanted to say it more firmly. Lincoln wanted to call things by their true names. But at the last moment, he softened his words, backed down, and covered the wound with beautiful phrases. And somewhere above the first line, like a needle in fabric, that name remains, one that no one prints in publications. The official story, gives us a ready-made image, a beard, a top hat, wise speeches, almost saintly. But the draft sitting on the table tells a different story. It shows a person who fights until the end, not against opponents, but with his own words. Someone who fears the power of his own speech. And at that moment, it becomes clear. The true words of Lincoln are not found in what he spoke from the podium, but in what he crossed out in silence. In another envelope, he notices a letter from a longtime political rival. This is a letter Lincoln was supposed to tear up and throw away, but it stuck in his mind so much that the country changed its course. He opens the envelope almost automatically. He gets dozens of letters like this. Complaints, threats, advice. But this one is different. It's from someone he has known for a long time. An old political rival. Not an ally. Not a friend. Someone who has been attacking him in newspapers and at rallies for years. The tone of the letter is odd. It's not venomous. It's not flattering. It's a cold, heavy conversation. Lincoln is not criticized for being against slavery. He's being attacked for being half-hearted, for still holding on to the hope that the Union can be saved without touching the sacred cow of the South. Lincoln reads and grows grim. The author doesn't defend slavery. On the contrary, he describes it in such detail that it's clear he has witnessed it. Hands that are entwined with ropes, families torn apart, people sold like furniture. And then there's a phrase that seems to take Lincoln's breath away. You want to keep the house without calling the fire a fire? It's a blow to the most sensitive spot. Lincoln really tried for a long time to speak carefully, to balance things out, to calm both the North and the South. He kept saying that his main goal was to preserve the Union. And it seemed like he was constantly pushing the issue of slavery aside, breaking it down bit by bit to avoid tearing the country apart all at once. But now he's being accused of the opposite. They're saying that this very gentleness is what's killing the nation. While he's trying to find the right words, people are still living in chains. His caution isn't helping the world. It's benefiting those who refuse to let go of their slaves at any cost. Lincoln picks up a pencil and starts marking the margins. He argues. He disagrees. He writes short, sharp comments. Then he crosses them out, because some things sound too honest, even for a rough draft. But the main thing happening right now isn't on paper. It's in his mind. He's replaying the last few months, remembering the runaway slaves who came to the camp of the Northerners. He recalls the generals who sent people back to their owners to avoid upsetting the border states. He thinks of the letters from soldiers that clearly say, "We don't understand why we're dying if slavery is still around." And suddenly, the foreign words blend with his own exhaustion. He had felt it for a long time, but hadn't dared to put it into words. His opponent was clear. While you pretend to fight for an abstract union, the South is fighting for a very real right to keep people in bondage. And they're winning on that front. For Lincoln, this isn't just a political remark. This is an accusation of personal weakness. That he, as a lawyer and a master of words, is afraid to name the real reason for the war. Afraid to say out loud that the country is falling apart, not because of tariffs, not because of abstract states' rights, but because one half is building its life on slave labor. He puts the letter aside, paces around the room, comes back, and reads it again. This time slowly, hanging on to every phrase. And at some point, something clicks inside him. Not in the direction the writer expects, but it clicks nonetheless. He realizes there's no turning back. No more later. No more not the right time. No more speeches where slavery is hidden behind fancy words. The war is already on, and people are dying. The only honest way to explain to them What this is all about is to tell the whole truth. A few days later, Lincoln takes out a blank sheet of paper and starts writing what will later be called the most daring move of his life. He stops talking only about the Union, and for the first time clearly connects the outcome of the war with the freedom of the people he had previously mentioned almost in passing. The strangest part is something else. He was pushed into this, not by an ally, not by an abolitionist, not by someone who supported the end of slavery. It was an old adversary who nudged him, a person who aimed to strike at him but hit a spot that had been hurting for a long time. From that moment on, Lincoln stopped hiding behind cautious wording. His old position is fading away like an old mask. He's still weighing his words, but now it's not for convenience. It's so that one of those words becomes a line that the country can never cross back over. In a few hours, the same handwriting will show up in the military file. He picks up the pen and realizes that he's not just writing words, he's changing the course of the war. Washington is on edge these days. The reports from the front are grim, and the generals are arguing over who's to blame, while the maps on the table are getting redder with each mark. Lincoln moves among those maps as if he's walking through wounds. He has already written a draft of the proclamation for the emancipation of slaves. But a draft is not reality yet. It's just an idea. He needs to turn it into an order. He locks himself in his office and asks not to be disturbed. On the desk is a letter from his opponent, next to his own draft. 2 pieces of paper, 2 voices. One person accuses him of being weak. Another demands that he show determination. He sits in silence for a long time, then makes a note in the margins. Another one. He crosses it out. He rewrites it. At some point, the text becomes tougher. There are no more soft qualifiers. No more trying to please everyone. There's only one line. Freedom becomes part of the military objective. But that's not enough. One decision isn't sufficient. War isn't just a boardroom. It's an army. And an army thrives on advances and retreats. Right now, as luck would have it, the generals are preparing for a major offensive. The plan is almost finalized. At the headquarters, they're drawing arrows and planning routes. Everyone is waiting for the order to move. He calls the soldiers to him. People come into the room who think in kilometers, batteries, and the number of bayonets. For them, the main goal is to win the battle. For him now, it's about finding meaning. And suddenly, these 2 tasks collide head-on. He listens to their reports, calm and almost emotionless. The generals speak in numbers and distances. They're convinced that they need to move forward while there's still a chance. But Lincoln has a different calculation in mind. If the army launches an offensive now, it will become the main focus. Newspapers, conversations, rumors, everything will head to the front, and his proclamation will drown in the sound of cannons. It will fade into the background, just a side note. He can't let the most important document of his life become just another story on the 3rd page. He needs the country to hear every word, so that the soldier who goes into battle tomorrow knows he's fighting for more than just borders on a map. He's fighting so that no one stands next to him in chains. That's why he takes a step that seems crazy to the military. He says, cancel the offensive. Not postpone, not clarify, not adjust. Just cancel. A heavy silence fills the room. The generals aren't shouting, but their eyes say it all. For them, it's a loss of momentum, a loss of initiative, a risk. He stands his ground. He explains simply. First, the proclamation. First, the meaning. Then, the action. War can no longer be faceless. We can't keep pretending this is just about the flag and the Union. If he stays silent now, everything will go back to how it was. The Union might survive, but the same old whip will still be cracking over the same people. The decision has been made. The papers with military plans are sent back, now bearing his signature of cancellation. The generals leave dissatisfied. Some think he's naive, while others see him as a threat. But it's at this moment that Lincoln puts morality above tactics for the first time. Not in a speech, not in a letter, but in a real order. He goes back to his desk. He picks up his draft and reads it again, this time as a commander, not as a lawyer. Every word in this document is now tied to real people, to specific battles, to a cancelled offensive. He signs it. His hand shakes, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. From this day on, the war officially changes its face. The South is still fighting for slavery, but now the North is fighting not just for the Union. This new goal is already written into orders, schedules, and the life of the Army. The cost of this decision is rising, but so is the stake. There's no turning back now. Later, the researcher will find evidence of this decision in military reports. The official story falls apart here because there's a document in the archives that contradicts Lincoln. Here's how it's usually told. Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. A grand gesture, a moral turning point. War exists on one side and plans on the other. There's no direct connection. Everything is neatly organized. But in reality, there's a point where these two lines intersect. It's very specific and very tangible. A date, a signature, an order. And that point is like a hole in a pretty story. Later, after his death, a stubborn researcher dug into military documents, not into generals' memoirs or grand speeches, but into thick, boring folders, operation logs, telegrams, orders that were never meant for the public. And here's what he finds. In one of the packets, there's a plan for an offensive in the fall, a carefully crafted schedule, deadlines, directions, forces. Below it, a clear, confident signature from the military command. And next to it, a brief note in a different handwriting. He recognized that handwriting already. You could spot it even in copies. Sharp letters, a rigid slant. This was written by Lincoln. Just a few words in the margins. But it's exactly those words that break the usual school image. In these words, he doesn't ask. He doesn't consult. He doesn't push back deadlines. He completely cancels the operation. And the date on this note matches another document, the draft of the proclamation, the very one that will later be talked about as a pure impulse of conscience. Matching days, matching steps. First, the cancellation of the event. Then, moving through his text. The researcher checks the headquarters logs. Suddenly, a flash of discontent appears in the reports. The operation that had been discussed for weeks suddenly goes nowhere. The commanders report a delay. Reports are showing strange phrases about adjusting plans by the highest order. But there's no real adjustment happening. It's just one thing, to stop. And this is where the official version starts to stumble. She portrays Lincoln as someone who waits for military successes before cautiously releasing his document, as if he's adjusting to the front lines. It seems like the proclamation is just an add-on to a victory. But the archives tell a different story. The front was actually adjusted to fit the proclamation. Not just a moral gesture, not just words on paper, but a decision that made its way into a living army, into charts, into columns, into calculations for marches. Here it is, that very point where idealism turns into a direct order, where the phrase about the freedom of black people takes precedence over a planned strike against the enemy. Why this matters? Because the whole polished story rested on one convenient myth. Lincoln is the wise balancer. He doesn't rush things. He signs off on what was already brewing, just a little earlier or a little later. But the records from his office reveal a different person. He doesn't wait for the moment. He creates that moment. He doesn't say, "I'll provide a beautiful text once the army wins." He does the opposite. First, he establishes a new meaning for the war. Only then does he move the troops. And this isn't captured in anyone's memories, but in plain military documents. In those very lines that weren't written for future textbooks. From this point on, the official version gets tricky. If we acknowledge this connection, we also have to accept something else. That the cancelled offensive is the cost of the document. That for every word in the proclamation, he paid with real military risk. The archive doesn't shout. He's just lying there, waiting for someone to match the dates and signatures. And when you do that, the polished picture falls apart. Lincoln wasn't a careful notary of history. He signed something that crossed out two paths at once: the old meaning of the war and the already planned advance. And that signature is still visible in the corner of the yellowed page, where the war paused for just one day for a single phrase about freedom. In a nearby case, the archivist finds another verified report. On one sheet of paper, the war truly hit pause. From here on, there are no more guesses or pretty legends. It's a specific day, the 15th of September. An order from the headquarters, signed by the general himself. The message is clear: postpone the planned offensive. The reason isn't hidden behind the weather or vague phrases like "the circumstances have changed." The text states it plainly: waiting for a presidential document. Not just any document, but the one Lincoln spoke about in private. The Emancipation Proclamation. This is where history starts to get bumpy. The generals are already preparing for movement. The routes are set. Troops are being gathered. Supplies are being brought in. And suddenly, a new logic comes from above. Not military, but political and moral at once. First, we change the meaning of the war. Then, we move the troops. In the archive, it looks almost dull. A sheet of gray paper. On the left, the case number. On the right, the date. Below the text, a neat signature. But if you place another document next to it, you can see how these dull lines disrupt the usual narrative. In the diary of one of the officers from the same headquarters, there's a note. He writes that the command is waiting for word from Washington, after which everything will change. He doesn't mention the proclamation by name, but the dates match, and the tone is the same. They understand that this isn't just about a private directive. It's about a move after which you can't fight the old way anymore. There's another report from headquarters in Washington. It has a straightforward message. Offensive actions will be synchronized with the announcement of the presidential decision. They're not adjusted to the weather. They're not tied to supplies. They're synced with a text that hasn't even been published yet. This isn't the memories of old folks 40 years later. It's not polished memoirs. It's real-time correspondence during a war. People aren't writing for history. They're just capturing what's happening. And in these lines, the main point is clear. The proclamation didn't stick to victory like a label. The army awaited it as a signal, as a new framework within which they would have to fight. There's a telegram sent a few days before the announcement. It's short, almost like a telegram fragment. But there's one detail in it. Could you please clarify when the president's public statement will be made? And there's a note from an official saying, related to planned operations. This is the moment when the myth completely falls apart. It's not the front that tells Washington when it's convenient to talk about freedom. Washington is telling the front when to stop and wait for this phrase. One of the minutes from the military cabinet meeting notes another detail. They're not just discussing the text of the proclamation. They're talking about how it will be received in the army, who will support it, and who will be unhappy. And the main thing is how this will affect discipline and motivation. This document isn't meant to be just some abstract moral lesson. It's a strike at the very foundation of the war. After this, you can't tell the soldier that we're just going back to normal. After this, he's fighting for something else. And they understood that from the start. That's why there are so many cautious phrases in the documents about one simple thing. We need to take a pause. We need to halt the advance that's already in motion. We have to wait for the moment when Lincoln's words become the new front line. The archive doesn't draw conclusions. He just lays out the dates, signatures, delayed orders, and telegrams with notes next to each other. But when you look at them as a chain, it becomes clear that everything converges at one point. On the day when the presidential text takes precedence over the next attack. And in the same case where the transfer of the onset is filed, there's another sheet, a brief resolution. Just a few lines. But it contains a clear indication of where exactly the signal to stop came from. A little later, another archive fund will present yet another match. And here comes the document that completely shatters the beautiful legend of a happy coincidence. This isn't a memory from years later. It's not someone's feelings. It's not a lovely story told in hindsight. It's a plain sheet from a military archive. A date, a signature, a brief note, postpone the offensive. And right under this order, there's another line, written in a different handwriting. A note that ties everything together. Awaiting the President's statement. No vague words, no hints. A clear indication that the military plan hinges on one future text. This is where the myth completely falls apart. It's not quite how people usually tell it, as if Lincoln just seized a lucky opportunity. On the contrary, the moment was shaped around his words. In another case, in a different archive, there's a telegram. The commander on the front is asking Washington, «Когда ждать публичного заявления?» And next to it, a note from the official, it's related to the planned operations. This doesn't seem like a coincidence anymore. It's a direct link to a military scheme tied to one presidential document. Another protocol, a meeting of the military cabinet. It's recorded with almost no emotion. They're not just talking about what Lincoln is going to say. They're discussing how it will be received by those holding rifles. Who will approve? Who will be furious? How to maintain discipline? How to explain to the soldier that from this day on, he's fighting not just for the flag, but for someone else's freedom as well. It's important to note that they don't think about this afterward. They don't justify it in hindsight. They consider it in advance, as a factor, as a risk, as a weapon. The documents show that the proclamation wasn't just a moral gesture thrown into the void. It was integrated into the war schedule. They adjusted the offensive around it. They reorganized orders to accommodate it. In one instance, the date of the attack is pushed back by a few days. In another, there's an order to await further instructions from the president. These papers weren't written for the public. They're internal documents that were never meant to look polished. But it's in their starkness that their power lies. There's no attempt to impress anyone. No fancy phrases. Just a series of actions. We wait for the text, then we move forward. If we lay out all these papers chronologically, it creates a very clear timeline. First, there's the discussion. How will the Army respond? Then comes the question from the front. When will the statement be made? Then the operation is postponed. After that, a note. Due to, and in the end, it's the date when Lincoln signs his text. The archive doesn't explicitly say it was a conscious choice. It simply shows how reality aligns with a single phrase. The front pauses, waiting for the words, and at the moment they are spoken, war takes on a new meaning. one that has already been captured long before on plain, unadorned sheets of paper. Then, in another box, in a different folder, there's another document that leads to the most uncomfortable conclusion. The initiative to stop the troops didn't come from the ground. It didn't come from the battlefield. It came from above, from that room where Lincoln already had every word of the future letter in his mind. Another confirmation will soon emerge from the same archive. The official story starts to crumble when real documents come to light instead of just schoolyard tales. In the archive lies a thin, almost invisible sheet. It has a few lines on it. The language is dry, not a single loud word. But it's this document that connects a military order, a pause on the front lines, and Lincoln's future speech in a single thread. The signature on the paper isn't from a soldier. It's not from a field general. It's not a shout from the front. It's an initiative from above. It's where the war is viewed on a map, like a series of arrows and dates. At the top of the page is a date that initially seems random, but when you place it next to other documents, it becomes clear. On this day, the front was supposed to advance. The troops are ready. Supplies are in place. Orders have already been sent out. And then, suddenly, a brief phrase. Halt. Wait for further instructions. Just a pause. And this is where the usual picture breaks down. For many years, we've been told that Lincoln first makes a grand statement, and then the war adjusts to it. But the documents show the opposite. First, they hit the brakes. First, they stop living people with loaded weapons. Only then does the text that will go down in history appear. In another document, already from the military department, there's a reference to this order. An officer at the front writes that the operation has been postponed. The wording is cautious. But there's one detail. He's not talking about the weather or a lack of people. He's referring to Washington's decision. And right next to it, it's neatly noted, waiting for the president's statement. Not if, not possibly. It's as if everyone already knows it's coming. They're just waiting for it to be signed. It doesn't feel like a sudden impulse. It doesn't seem like a moment of clarity. It feels more like a script, where Lincoln's words are just one part of the plan, one of the tools. That so-called moral gesture, which textbooks present as a separate, almost heavenly act, actually turns out to be woven into the schedule of troop movements. The time for soldiers to ponder is planned out in advance. In one report, the commander asks for clarification on whether he should start the offensive before or after the president's statement. The response is brief. Wait. There's a stamp, a signature, and a date. And here's the most troubling part. There's no sign of pressure from below in any of these documents. No rebellious letters from the trenches. There are no mass protests from the generals demanding Lincoln to make a decision. On the contrary, the Army is adapting. The Army is waiting for those at the top to finish the text. In that quiet office, they are still debating the wording. They are tweaking the words and rearranging the phrases. Somewhere on the front line, real people are sitting in the mud, waiting because they've been told not to move. The archives paint a harsh picture. No romance, no historical inspiration. There's a connection, a secret order, a pause in the offensive, a request from the front, a response from Washington, and only then, Lincoln's famous letter. Not the other way around. This is what turns the usual story on its head. It turns out that the moral step wasn't a sudden burst of conscience, but a calculated moment, timed to a war that had been put on hold. The whole machine, from the generals to the last soldier, comes to a standstill for several days, for a text that isn't even on paper yet. It's just kept in their minds. And while the official story keeps talking about a great surge, there's a thin sheet in the archive that calls everything by its name. Pause, wait, act after the president's order. Another description from the same collection notes a similar detail. On one of the gray archive folders, there's a note written in black on white. Suspend the operation pending the president's statement. This isn't a memoir or a recollection years later. It's a document written while the events were still fresh. At the top, there's a date. Below, the names of the commanders. Next comes a dry statement. Don't start the offensive until orders come from Washington. Next to it is a neat note, waiting for the president's announcement. This isn't a historian's fantasy. It's not a pretty legend. It's a specific order that went through the headquarters, the secretariat, and the military office. On the back of the same page, there's a note from the field commander. He asks if it's possible to move forward, even just a little, if the conditions are right, if the enemy weakens their positions, if there's a chance to capture a crucial height. The response from Washington is brief. Stop. Wait. No interpretations, no emotions, no discussions about morality. At the bottom, there's a stamp, the signature of the responsible person, the date and time. From these figures, it's clear that the pause doesn't last for hours. For several days, the troops have literally been standing still. The main reason is stated in the documents very simply: the upcoming announcement from the president. That moment will go down in history as a noble moral gesture and Lincoln's personal decision. In other folders, reports from the same dates are found. The same pattern emerges. Similar requests come in from different parts of the front. Commanders report their readiness to attack and describe the enemy's position. They're asking for guidance. In response, they're sent the same line. Align actions with the administration's position and wait for directives after the president's address. Somewhere at the bottom of the page, it's scrawled in ink. Do not disclose. This no longer feels spontaneous. It's a chain. Agreed delays, the same wording, a single decision-making center. The reports from the headquarters don't mention any pressure from below. There are no accounts of widespread discontent among the soldiers demanding immediate change. No panic letters from generals that biographers like to reference later. The plans say something completely different. The field units are waiting for the signal from the top. One of the meeting protocols with the defense minister clearly states that a political statement needs to be made before any active deployment of forces. It's a clear connection. The president speaks first, then the army moves. Lincoln's name comes up in a dry and ordinary way. He's not a prophet or a hero on a horse. He's just a point on the agenda. After discussing supplies, troop placements, and possible enemy reactions, someone says to check with the president about the readiness to make an announcement. Then, in another document, a draft of the text appears. This isn't the famous final version yet. It's a working draft. There are edits in different inks in the margins. One hand crossed out a word, while the other wrote in a stronger phrasing. Notes indicate where the key paragraph should be read. There's also a pencil mark for the estimated date. Next to it is a note from the secretary indicating that the military command has been informed about the operations being tied to this day. When you put these sheets together, a very simple but unpleasant picture emerges. First, there's an exchange of messages between the headquarters. Then, an order to halt the offensive. After that, clarifications come in from the front. And only after all this, the text emerges that will later be called Lincoln's moral turnaround. It's not inspiration that holds back the war. The war waits for the phrases to be finished up top. Checking the dates tightens this version even more. The order to suspend operations was signed before the first recorded final version of the presidential letter. There's a small gap in time, but it exists. First, a window of silence is created. Only then is it filled with deep meaning. Many years from now, Historians will talk about this as Lincoln's personal drama. They'll discuss the long nights of doubt and the heavy, almost mystical choices he faced. But at that moment, with fresh orders laid out next to the military map, everything looked different. It was just a regular bureaucratic process. First, coordinate the actions of the army and the administration. Establish a pause on the front lines. Make it clear that the reason for this pause isn't the weather or logistics, but rather an anticipated word from the White House. Only after that, reveal the letter, which will later be given an air of surprise. Inside the archive, there isn't a single document that supports the beautiful legend that Lincoln single-handedly broke the general's resistance. Instead, there are many quiet, neatly organized papers where his decision is woven into the overall narrative. Not apart from the war, but alongside it. Not on top of the strategy, but right in it. One sheet marked "Awaiting the President's Statement" flips the usual perspective. It shows that grand words aren't above history. They're woven into the schedule. In another description from the same collection, there's a similar pause before another crucial step. Meanwhile, in a neighboring entry, there's another comparable episode. All the romance about lonely Lincoln in the night falls apart when you look at his letter through the eyes of an archivist rather than a fan. In the archive, it's not a sacred text, just another sheet in a long folder. There's a date next to it, a signature beside that, and a dry note from the secretary saying the Army Command has already been informed. The operations are tied to this day. And when you start lining up these documents, all the beautiful legends fade away. First, there's the usual communication between the headquarters. Just standard phrases and a normal tone. Then comes the order. Halt the advance. After that, there are updates from the front lines, detailing who is where, who has already received the signal, and who is still waiting. And only after that, in the prepared pause, the text of the letter appears, which would later be called Lincoln's moral turning point. It's not the letter that stops the war. The war slows down in advance so that the letter can be finished in time. A look at the dates completely shatters any illusions. The order to suspend operations was signed before the first recorded final version of the presidential text appears in the archive. It's a small gap, but it exists. First, a moment of silence is created. Only then is it filled with lofty words. Years later, this will be described as Lincoln's agonizing nights. Like a personal drama. Like the inner struggle of a person standing alone against the generals. But on that day, when the military map was spread out on the table and fresh orders were neatly stacked beside it, everything seemed much simpler. Just a regular bureaucratic process. First, coordinate the actions of the Army and the administration. Establish a pause on the front. Note that the reason for the pause isn't the weather or supply issues. The reason is the anticipated word from the White House. Only after that, the letter comes into play, which will later be given an aura of surprise and insight. Inside the archive, there isn't a single document that backs up the beautiful story of Lincoln single-handedly breaking the military's resistance. Instead, it's filled with quiet, neatly arranged pages where his decision is woven into the overall narrative. Not separate from the war, but intertwined with it. Not on top of the strategy, but right inside it. One humble sheet marked "Awaiting the President's Statement" shifts the perspective more than thick biographies. It shows that grand words don't just hover over history, they're woven into the schedule. In another description from the same foundation, there's a similar pause before yet another key step. The same logic, the same pause, the same pattern. First, a silence agreed upon by the authorities. Then a loud decision that was already planned as part of the campaign. As you turn the pages, another episode with the same handwriting appears in the adjacent description. The same pause. the same note. That same cold handwriting in the margins, neatly attached to the myth of a person making life-changing decisions all alone. Another archival case reveals yet another documentary coincidence. The official story starts to crack when a quiet, almost unnoticed sheet of paper comes to light. In another archival case, another coincidence emerges that the legend can no longer dismiss. The case number, the same handwriting on the cover, the same dry phrases inside. And then, suddenly, a familiar formula. A halt in operations. A pause in troop movements. A note in the margins, written in that same cold, confident handwriting, awaiting the president's decision. Not inspiration, not a flash of insight, just a decision.